Okay, welcome everyone to week 5 of Platonism and Christianity. It's Monday the 7th of December 2020, and this week we're going to talk about mysticism and negative theology. Before we get started, I've got a few little announcements. Next Sunday coming, at 5 p.m. we've got our Christmas party, and Maria's graciously offered to host it at her house. So we need to get a gauge of numbers to see how many people are going to be there. So if you are planning to come, please RSVP to Effie. You might have her email address. Alternatively, you can just post in the chat to Effie, and I'm sure she'll be able to note that down. And that's going to be really fun. So I look forward to seeing everyone there that can make it. Next classes coming up are going to be starting in the first week of February, and we're going to be running 3 classes concurrently. It's going to be the Republic, Sacred Geometry or Geometry, which is going to be taught by Nabil, an excellent, very experienced geometer, I guess. And that's going to be going to have his own equipment, like all the set squares and all that, the drawing materials. So you want to book into that one because it's going to be pretty special. And we're going to do reading Plato again, which is just the beginner's class, just our regular introductory class. So we're going to be running all 3 of those at the same time, and they'll all be starting in the first week of Feb. And so, yeah, if you think anyone that you know might be interested in any of them, do pass along the word so that we can get our numbers up. The class sizes are going to be smaller than this one. This is a kind of a special trial lecture series. We've got a lot of people in this class, but normally we try and keep it to about 10 to 12. And there's going to be a bit more time for question and answer usually. And we're hoping to get that done in the Greek Center on Lonsdale Street in the city. And also finally, we're going to try and make those hybrid classes. So there'll be the regular students in the building, and then if you can't make it because you're out of state, you can hopefully Zoom in. It should be fine. And
that's made clear on the website, David, and on the enrolment, etc. Because I've been asked that question by some people.
I'm not too
okay,
sure.
I can respond to that. So I'll just jump in here and say we haven't advertised it properly on the website. It's just gone up. I wanted to do that after today so that you guys got an opportunity, just in case there's a bit of a rush, especially on geometry. So you guys can find it, and you can go into the courses and find it. I think that information about the Zoom option is there, but I'll put a special blog up tomorrow advertising it all and making quick links straight through to where you need to go. Okay,
cool.
So what will happen if there's only 10 people for the geometry and there's 20 of us here? Which green bottles fall off the wall?
Well, we'll just see who's interested, Effie. We actually might be able to run another class on the Friday as well. So, yeah. So, but yeah, if you do want to do it, just book early, or if you want to particularly do the Friday, let me know. David, we can talk about that later. Anything else, David?
Yeah, there's a few more things. This coming week, I'll be sending around a feedback survey. Returning students will have already done this. We just send them out after each class just to see if there's anything we can improve or anything we should keep doing. So I think it takes about 5 minutes, if that, to fill that out. So if you can, please take the time to do that. And then finally, just the normal announcements that we're going to be recording this, posting it to our resources page, which I'll put a link to in the chat right now. So if you ever miss a class, you can go to this page and catch up.
David, is that page just for these lectures or for the preceding ones as well?
It's for the Platonism and Christianity series.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So they'll all be, or the previous 4 weeks are all posted up there.
Because I missed some of Phaedro, so I'd have to go back into and find the...
Yeah, I can find that for you and post it in the chat before the end of the class.
That's fine.
And yeah, if you have any questions during the lesson this week, post them in the chat and we'll get to them during the question time.
Mm-hmm.
About it. I think we should get going because there's a lot to
Oh, hang on. Where do you find chat, by the way, on my screen?
if you look at the very bottom of your screen, so hover your mouse over.
Chat, yeah.
Click on participants and chat and share screen and just click on the
Share
chat.
screen. Is there any way of putting it over on the side somewhere so you can see the chat going at the same time as you're watching everything else going on?
It should be possible. I think if you maximize your window, try and make it as big as possible.
I've got my Zoom maximized.
Or maybe minimize, I don't know. There should be a way, I'm just not too sure.
Oh, all right.
For me, it's on the side. It's
Oh, all right.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. That's great. Yeah, looking forward to seeing everyone next Sunday. And thank you, Maria, again for offering. That's really nice. Now, David and I did have a talk before the class. We talked about a lot of things, but I forgot to mention that I'm kind of running a week behind. So this week we are going to do the allegory myth stuff, as I think I mentioned last week. And then next week we will do mysticism, as well as Christianity's oldest creation, you know, like the understanding of how the believer's understanding of how to combine non-Christian, non-canonical works with into the Christian realm, how that all worked. So, but today we're going to talk about Platonism, Christianity in terms of myths, stories, allegories, the use of fiction, imaginative narratives, and so on. So, and we're going to start with a bit of a reading. So, have we got Phil there? Has Phil disappeared?
No, I'm here.
Oh,
Can you hear
okay.
me
I've just
okay?
lost you, Phil. Okay, off you go. Off you go.
Good, good.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
I'm over there. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well, for me, you
Good.
are. Yeah. Off you
Okay.
go.
All right, all right. The Phaedo is Plato's fictional account of Socrates' last day before taking the poison in the evening. Just before he does, Socrates says, if death meant being separated from everything, it would be a godsend for the bad to die and be separated at once from the body and from their own badness, along with the soul. But as things are, given that the soul is evidently immortal, there'd be no way for it to escape from evils, no way of saving itself, except by becoming as good and wise as possible. For if a soul goes to the other world, taking nothing with it except its education and nurture, which are in fact the very things that are said to do the greatest benefit or harm to the person who has died, from the very beginning of his journey to that other place. This is how the story goes. What they say is that, in fact, each person's own guardian spirit, the one to whom he has been allotted in life, tries to bring him after his death to a certain place where the assembled company must submit themselves for trial before journeying to the other world. Now, when the dead come to the place to which each is taken by his guardian spirit guide, they first submit to a process of judgment, both those who have lived fine and pious lives and those who have not. Those judged to have lived a middling kind of life journey to the river Acheron, where they board the vessels available to them and use these to journey to the lake. There they reside and undergo purification, each as he deserves, paying penalties to absolve him from any crimes committed and receiving honours for any benefits bestowed. As for those judged incurable because of the enormity of their errors, whether they have repeatedly stolen large sums from temples, persistently killed people contrary to justice and the law, or committed other such crimes as there may be, the fate of these, fittingly, is to be cast into the infernal abyss of Tartarus and never to emerge again. Another category fated to be thrown into Tartarus consists of those judged to have committed errors that are curable, but serious. For example, people who have committed an act of violence towards a father or a mother, but live out the rest of their lives regretting it, or who have become killers under some other similar circumstances. But when these have been in Tartarus for a year, its surge disgorges them into a river. And as they are carried along beside the Arcarusian lake, they scream and call out to those they killed or to those they assaulted. Their calls are followed by supplication. And as they beg their victims to permit their exit from their river to the lake and to admit them there, if they succeed in persuading them, they get out and cease from their suffering. But if not, then they are carried off again to Tartarus, and from there back again into the rivers that will go on happening to them again and again until they do persuade those they wronged, because that is the penalty imposed upon them by the judges. But those judged to have done exceptionally well towards living piously are the ones who are freed from these regions here within the earth and are released as if from prisons, moving to that pure place of residence. And from among these very people, those who purified themselves sufficiently well by means of philosophy, dwell entirely without bodies for the time thereafter, and come to reside in the most beautiful places. It is for the sake of the things we have described, Simmias, that one must do everything to ensure one's share of goodness and wisdom in one's life. Fine is the prize and the hope great. There ends the story at which Socrates says, "Of course, no reasonable person ought to insist that the facts are exactly as I have described them here, but that this or something like it is true about our souls and the places in which they dwell, given that the soul is clearly something immortal. This, it does seem to me, to be worth insisting on and worth risking. For someone who thinks it to be so, the risk, after all, is a fine one. We should use such charms to enchant ourselves with, which is why I drew out my story for so long. In any case, these are the reasons why a man should have confidence about his soul. A man, that is, who in his life has waved goodbye to those other pleasures and adornments, namely those of the body, treating these as alien to him and doing more harm than good, who has instead occupied himself with the pleasures of learning and adorning his soul, not with alien adornments, but with those that belong to it: moderation, justice, courage, freedom, and truth, waits thus prepared for the journey to the next world, whenever fate should summon him. So you, said Socrates, Simmias and Cebes and all you others, will all make your separate journeys there at some future time. But for now, it is I whom fate calls, as a tragic character might say, and I think it's about time for me to head to the bath, because I think it'd be better to drink the poison freshly bathed and not give the women the trouble of washing a corpse."
Thank you, Phil. What are we to make of this? What are we to make of Plato's use of myth in the dialogues in other places as well? How do we interpret them? Do we take them literally? If we take them figuratively and pin down the definition of the interpretation, then why is he using a myth? Thanks for the reading, Phil. And this is the story of the soul's journey into the afterlife that includes guardian angel, a moral judgment on one's life, then reward or retribution, purgatory, heaven and hell. Does any of that sound familiar? This story seems to be drawn from popular Greek myth, but perhaps also from the mystery cults, in a way that brings it close to Christian myth of the soul's afterlife, mythology that has survived to our time. Notice that there is very little of this in the Bible. The Old Testament talks of the spirit as opposed to the physical animal body, and of possession by the Holy Spirit, and of the divine logos within. Many times it explains that this is the kingdom of God and the taste of eternity. The Bible does not use the language of the soul or psyche, nor does it say much about what happens immediately after one dies. Compare this to John's Apocalypse. In the Bible's last book, the book of Revelation, there is a judgment, but this is on Judgment Day. This is at the end of the world as we know it, the end of history. On that particular day, and by the way, the end is nigh, on that great day, at the end of times, the dead will be physically raised from their graves so that good folks, both the quick and the dead, may come to life in the New Jerusalem. Remember, the Romans destroyed the old Jerusalem? This New Jerusalem will descend from heaven for Christ's reign on earth. This is the canonical second coming story. As we so often find in Christianity, so here in the teaching on salvation, there are two competing but overlapping narratives. In this case, the overlap is that both have a moral judgment followed by reward and retribution. Down through the history of Christianity, the Bible story of the end of times would compete with and blend with stories of what individual souls would experience after they separate from the body directly after death. That such stories of the soul's afterlife, after separating from the body, are nowhere explicit in the Bible, should be no surprise for those who recall the strong and explicitly policed separation of the mortal from the immortal in old Judaism, symbolized, as we remember, by the guarding of the tree of life. The story of the soul's afterlife that Phil just read is a direct challenge to this. It is a story of the mortal's immortality. It says, yes, the body is mortal, but we also have this invisible soul which is immortal and which aspires to divinity. Such stories of the soul in Hellenistic times were strongly associated with Platonism, and those of us who have read some Plato will remember such stories not only in Plato's Phaedo, as we've just heard, but also in the Republic, the myth of and in the Phaedrus, the winged chariot story. And these stories are reflected in the early church writings about the immortality of the soul. In the early church fathers, there is even pre-existence before conception, even reincarnation. Reincarnation in Christianity, yeah, you bet, but it was Platonized, but such Platonization of Christianity was soon extinguished. Not extinguished was the stories of the soul's afterlife. These would live on and thrive without biblical authority, indeed almost without dogmatic authority. If you take a look at the church doctrinal texts, catechisms and such, it is hard to find much detail about exactly what goes on to the soul in the afterlife. The soul's reward and punishment, purgatory, heaven and hell are generally only vaguely referenced. Those who were brought up in Christianity might be surprised by this, as I was. What was your Sunday school vision? Perhaps you were hammered with an end of days apocalypse. But in modern times, in middle-class, respectable, sober Christianity, the end of the world stuff is rather, well, Dark Ages, medieval. Instead, I suspect that most of us heard that if you're a good boy or girl, then after you die, your soul will perhaps spend some time in purgatory or otherwise go straight to heaven to live with God in happiness forever. But this is not the original, essential biblical teaching of Christianity. The original and core teaching is the one in Revelations, where the dead will rise on the last day, judged and so forth. No body and soul there. Extra-biblical stories of the soul and its journey into the afterlife survived and evolved through storytelling, retelling, through preaching, through Sunday school fables, through fiction, and through art. And by the way, this is not the only major story in Christianity that's been compelled through our history in this way. Another, perhaps more important one, are all the stories about Mary, the godmother. And they are as powerful, if not more powerful, via a non-canonical transmission. Okay, so let's now turn to the passage from the Phaedro that Phil just read. Notice how Socrates introduces the story by saying, this is how the story goes. It's a signal that he's telling a story, even more explicit than once upon a time. And then at the end he says, well, of course, no reasonable person ought to insist that the facts are exactly as I described. Why then is Socrates telling the story? Remember that otherwise the character of Socrates in Plato is always going on and on about getting to the truth. He has just proved the immortality of the soul, but only in a very formal way. Just as the number 3 is immortal, so is the soul. If any particular 3 goes away, then the number 3 itself survives. Not much consolation for the ego self there. But as for this story of the soul's journey into the afterlife, it does give much consolation to the ego self of the good and worthy listener. Socrates closes his story by saying, well, something like this is probably true. It is worth the risk if we believe, and we should use such charms to enchant ourselves. What is he saying? Is Plato, through Socrates, suggesting that the story that Phil just read out may serve as a lullaby for the dying? A lullaby that Socrates tells to himself and his friends to allay anxiety at this intense moment. This and more are suggested a few pages back in the dialogue, where the whole question of the dialectic method of inquiry comes into question. Socrates talks about the distorting influence on investigations of this sort. Those that have a vested interest in a particular outcome of the dialectic tend to lead the inquiry astray. It's because what they're after is persuasion, like in public speaking, when you're trying to persuade people to a particular opinion. That's rhetoric. That's the rhetoric of the sophists. But then Socrates says, well, I feel at my present moment that I'm nearly as bad as they are. His present moment? He's just about to die. Right at that moment, within an hour before his death, just before he takes the bath, Socrates has a rather strong investment in the outcome of the debate over the immortality of the soul. Assent to the perhaps true belief that the soul is not immortal, that this is absolutely the final end, that might dull his cheery demeanor. But Socrates then says that he has weighed his position carefully. If his theory about the immortality of the soul is really true, then of course it's best to believe it. But what if it's false? Then it's also best to believe it. If death really is the final end, then by believing that it's not, he is less likely to distress his friends by giving way to self-pity. And if it is the final end, then his false opinion will die with him. This is just before Socrates tells the story that Phil just read out. Here Socrates is not talking about this fantastic story, but about the argument for immortality running right through the dialogue. He's saying that we will never really know the truth while we're alive, but by persuading ourselves to the perhaps false belief in the soul's immortality does little harm and much good, especially as death approaches. This argument for the immortality of the soul is at best speculation and at worst a comfort story. But now remember that this is Socrates speaking as a character in a story by Plato. And remember that this is even a story within the story in the framing narrative. And the readers know this. If they believe otherwise, then they are only suspending belief, as we all do with fiction. Sorry, suspending disbelief, as we all do with fiction. Plato is working with strategies of fiction here and in all his dialogues. He's working with them so as to make the reader self-conscious of the fictional status. I'm telling you a story of the afterlife, a story told by Phaedo about Socrates, proving that the soul is immortal, that yet does not meet Socrates' own criteria for sound dialectic practice, but that is, nevertheless, all to good purpose. We should enchant ourselves with such stories because, for one, it is calming for the dying and for his mourners, and also because it encourages folks to be good, to do good, and not to do bad things. Such stories are good for the individual and good for society. Socrates says, this is worth risking. The risk, after all, is a fine one. Now, compare this attitude to the Christian treatment of such stories of the soul's journey in the afterlife as they pass down orally and in the non-canonical writings. To some extent, this is how such stories have been treated in the Christian church. These stories are in the middle ground, not in the canon, not even in the dogma, the catechisms, but nor are they heretical. They are considered as a useful addition and supportive to the revealed canon. Apocrypha, as they say. In this view, all these stories of the afterlife, of reward and punishment, the fire and brimstone stories preached to the masses, the stories that fill children with fear, these are tolerated and encouraged because they are true, not because they are true, but because they make for good citizens and good society. Now, we could, of course, be less charitable here if we wanted to. We could say that these were used by the unscrupulous and powerful to control and oppress the masses. Anyway, this brings us back to Plato. Readers of Plato might remember that Plato was had an ambivalent attitude to Greek myth. Socrates suggests that he does not believe all those ghastly stories about the gods. Then in the Republic, Socrates declares a ban on poetry, on poets and poetry in his Utopia. They have a bad influence because they excite the bodily emotions. They persuade by emotion, not by reason. And because all this imagination distracts folks from attention in the other direction towards the forms. But then we find that there will be poetry in the Republic. This will be controlled by the state. The philosopher rulers will commission from the poets stories that model and promote virtue. Propaganda. Again, we get this self-conscious approach to myth. Socrates assesses the myth to assess its value. Myths are myths, and they have their uses. I mean that in a modern sense. For Plato, the myth is considered assessed, evaluated, not as it is, not literally, as telling of the activities of the gods, but for its psychosocial effect. Now, of course, this approach to traditional stories has its dangers. In coming right out and suggesting that their purpose is something other than speaking the truth is, well, disrespectful. And it is skeptical. Remember The historical Socrates was the very model of a skeptic, and he was killed for disrespecting the gods. So consider a story for its psychological or social impact, and not for its truth value, we might call the sociological approach to knowledge. Okay, the sociological approach, not truth, but its effect in society or psychologically. Was there such skepticism of traditional religion at or before Plato's time? Many people have asked that. Was the historical Socrates really such a skeptic? Probably, but we don't know. What we do know is that this sociological, self-conscious approach to cultural tradition certainly developed in the Hellenistic period. Among the Epicureans and the skeptics, religious stories were explicitly recognized to have a sociological purpose, and they were sometimes lampooned as affecting control of the populace through fear. We had that analysis in that time. This sociological approach to knowledge persisted in Roman literature. A marvelous example is found in Livy's History of Rome, where Livy describes how Emperor Caesar Augustus purposely introduced religion to keep the peace of Pax Roma. In the Renaissance, Machiavelli picked up on this, mind you, during perhaps the most corrupt time of the Roman Church, and a religious skepticism was revived in a sociological discourse, where knowledge was considered not in terms of its truth value, but in terms of its psychosocial effect, whether for comfort or for fear. Fear build a good society on fear of retribution in the afterlife. Comfort, we enchant ourselves, our ego selves, with stories of immortality to allay fear in the dying and sorrow in the morning. So that's my take on myths of the soul and its afterlife in Plato and Christianity. But I wonder what you think. I'm sure there's different views on that out there, and so we'd love to hear them. So next we'll discuss allegory in Plato and then in Christianity. But let's get some questions, comments, and reflections. Okay, David.
I just it was really fascinating, the line you've said. Plato's working with strategies of fiction here because he just didn't have the information here, which is what I've just done my PhD on. You know, when you don't have enough, you rely on oral histories to write a story. When is it acceptable for the fiction to be okay? And I had an argument yesterday with someone about this, talking about The Crown. You know, like to say did all the things they said he did in The Crown, which it could mislead people about him and turn people against him at this time. You know, so what we've got here with Plato, giving us a depiction of Socrates that, as you say, may not happen, may not have been that way at all. He may not have been a skeptic. You know, do we know anything else about him to be able to formulate his character, or is it really what Plato gave us?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Yeah, that's good. Anyone else?
Has anyone else other than Socrates written, other than Plato, written about Socrates?
Yes. Yes, Xenophon. There's rather a lot in writings of Xenophon, his memorabilia of Socrates. If you really want somebody who isn't Plato, but who did know Socrates personally, Xenophon, who was the general who took what was it, 10,000 soldiers across to Persia in their attempt to replace one Persian emperor with another. It didn't work. he was a military strategist, and a historian, and a friend of Socrates, and he wrote heaps.
Okay, thanks, Norman. I just got a comment from Jackie. Yeah, I mean, my interest is the same perhaps with Jackie, that my interest is more in the use of, for example, what Phil read out there, like telling that story, the use of that in Plato, where there's a conscious telling of the story. And then he gives a bit of an interpretation, or he gives a bit of a context to his telling of the story, you know, and we went through that. And yeah, I mean, the Socrates, whether Socrates is a fictional, you know, to what extent he's a fictional character in Plato, well, I always, as people know, I always try to avoid that, because I think you can just go on endlessly about what you don't know.
Bernie, we've seen through the stories and allegories in the books that we've read together about the soul, but also about the reincarnation of the soul, which is there in Plato's books. You mentioned that some of the early fathers of the church alluded to reincarnation. I mean, the Bible and what we, and I went to Sunday school, and God forbid if you could offer an example or anything like that, you might as well jump in the abyss on the spot. Can you please give some examples, or you know, like,
no worries.
Who said that? And
yeah, no worries.
Very interesting.
Yeah, okay, and we can get to this later as well when we actually get a bit closer to it. But pretty much Clement of Alexandria is the most famous one. And then shortly after him, there was Origen, who was also in Alexandria and trained in Alexandria, but then went on to live in other places. So they're the most famous ones. Now with Clement, yeah, it was total reincarnation along the Platonic lines. I mean, these guys just basically thought there was no conflict between what Plato taught and what Christianity taught, right? So they didn't see any issues. They just, you know, they just found the same in everything, except there was a bit more in Plato because God came, Jesus came to earth and so on. But apart from that, there was no conflict. And so Clement had this, yeah, this reincarnation thing. But you see, the thing is, we don't see this in Origen, but it's kind of suggested there, and people do wonder whether he was avoiding it. Because there's this really funny thing going on where, okay, so the soul, we start getting the story that the soul's immortal. And, you know, like historically, you and I perhaps think that we know where it's coming from historically. You know, it's come from Platonism or from these Greek sources. But then it's kind of cut off that it's immortal. And when's it immortal from? Birth or conception or whatever you want to say. Why then? Why at birth or conception? You know, why is that time so important? And so with Origen, he certainly had an idea, and this was fairly common as well, that the soul actually pre-existed birth as well as existed after birth. Now, whether it gets reborn into different bodies, that's another step that we still get back in Clement.
It's not so much in the Cappadocian fathers, though, from the limited amount. I haven't come across it. Are you aware if there is?
Sorry, it is or it is not?
Is there? I'm not aware.
I don't.
I would be in the Cappadocian fathers.
I would be surprised in the Cappadocian fathers. For those people who don't know, they were basically after Nicaea, weren't they? Yeah. So after Nicaea, that was when it became the state religion, and so things were really closing up. Then we're talking about the 2nd and 3rd century, well before things started getting heavy.
Bernie, wasn't it though that the Gospel of Thomas spoke about reincarnation, and yet that wasn't included in the New Testament?
I don't.
That's what I reckon.
Yeah, I don't remember it. I mean, I have read it a few times. I don't remember it sticking out there.
Yeah.
But it might be implied. implied. Certainly, yeah, some things
and
are.
So, and so these stories of the Platonists, sort of the immortality of the soul, went back to the Egyptians even, because of course they all believed in the afterlife, etc. So they built on those stories further.
But didn't the Egyptians believe in the body being, because, you know, they sort of built the pyramids, they embalmed the body, they put jewels to, you know, transport the body, you know, to the next world. It wasn't a sort of, with the Egyptians, I feel it wasn't a spiritual transition into the next world. It was a physical one. And, you know, and also Greeks also had a Charon, who, the ferryman who took people across to the other side. And when people died, they put money on, you know, coins on the dead person's eyes to pay the ferryman. So that was also a Greek belief at some stage, that it was the body, the person traveled to the next world.
Yeah, thanks, Fuller. This is what people say. Certainly, the soul, as it appears in Plato, the soul's in the body when you're alive, and then there's this separation at death. That way of seeing things, and particularly the word psyche, that way of seeing things and that word are traced back to Plato and maybe Pythagoreans and the mystery cults. So yeah, maybe there is something like that happening earlier. My view was more like Coolers, but you know, I'm not an expert, so we'll leave that. I'll leave that.
There is the ka, which I suppose in ancient Egyptians take the place of the soul, because the ka is what is being judged after death, and then if it was as light as a feather, then you could go on. It was emphasis though on you need material things to take with you in the afterlife.
Okay.
But, some ancient Greeks were being buried though with material things, a lot of things, maybe status, maybe also to take in the next life.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Maria. Can we have a couple of questions from anyone who hasn't spoken, and then we can...
Sue has a question in the chat, Bernie,
yep.
about the relationship between St. Augustine and Plato.
Oh, okay. So that's a really interesting one, because, and we can get to that a bit more later. St. Augustine was quite late. He was actually basically in the 5th century, the early 5th century AD, right? And he was over in Africa, and he didn't read Greek, and he only read Latin. You know, I think he read the Vulgate Bible. Was that there then? Yeah, he only read it in Latin. But the thing about Augustine is quite late. He's an intellectual. He had a journey, a spiritual journey, which he describes famously in the Confessions. It's a great read if ever you want to read a good autobiography. Perhaps the first contemplative one. And he tells this journey of his spiritual journey, and he took up Manichaeism. That's those two opposing forces things. You know, not one and nothing. This is like one and one. You know, two opposing forces, good and evil, if you like, matter and spirit, and so on. And so, but then he moved from that into Platonism, and then he moved from Platonism into Christianity, had a revelation and moved into Christianity, and he was immersed in Platonism. And then when he moved into Christianity, he saw no contradictions once again. There wasn't anything that he had in Platonism that he needed to reject. And so then he comes into Platonism in that way, and then he does a bit of what we're going to get to next, which is reinterpretation of the teachings, especially the old Jewish teachings, in a Platonic way, as an allegory. Yeah. Okay, maybe one more and I'll get going, and then we can hopefully have a longer questions at the end.
Sorry, can I just ask?
For...
Oh, are you go, Norman?
No, Norman's had a go, Nick, so it's your go, I reckon.
Was it necessary for, so when Plato described the soul's journey, and there was that image, I guess, of the soul, you know, sort of journeying, or some particular souls journeying through the river, you know, asking for forgiveness from the people that they'd murdered, or, you know, that they'd wronged. What was it? And then then he also said that it's better to believe, but is it necessary to believe that this is the journey for all of our souls? Yeah. So in the way that the Christians have to believe, you know, that there you know, certain sort of precepts of the church. So did Plato, because you also said that it's better to believe in, rather than actually believing. So even if you don't believe, would your soul make this journey?
Well, I don't know. You might have to ask a Christian theologian there, but I'll just say that, you know,
talking about Platonism.
There's the difference between, as we're saying, the non-canonical and catechism. You heard of catechism? That's what Christians call, you know, their book of doctrine. You know, this is what we believe and this is what we don't. Oh, well, you can go to the creed. Look at the creed, the Nicene Creed. There's no mention of this in that. And then you go to the catechism and there's vague references to it, just very vague references. Correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't looked at every catechism, but the ones I've seen. And so there's the canonical, the canon, and the doctrine, the dogma, and then there are these other stories, and they're like halfway in between, if you like, as I was saying, dogma and the canon, these prescribed texts, and heresy. So, and they can support it. So if you ask to say, what if I don't believe in this non-canonical story, will I still go to heaven? Well, that's what you maybe should ask your priest or your patriarch or something.
Did Plato, but when Plato wrote his particular...
Oh, Plato, okay. So Plato, it's all about turning the soul around, right? The mind's eye around, and you know, that stuff that hopefully we'll get to, Nick, if you do it with the Republic. You know, it's about turning yourself around and detaching. No, it's in the Phaedo too, you've done that. Detaching yourself from the body and becoming detached. And as you become more and more detached, then your journey into the afterlife is easier. Yeah, so yeah, he would be saying that, yeah, that you've got to do philosophy.
Okay. You must believe. You must believe.
Well, that's in Christianity, not in...
No, in Platonism. You must believe that the spirit is higher than the body. You must believe that you must leave the body. You can't just spend your life being an ascetic without truly believing that you are achieving something higher.
Yeah, well, I kind of agree with that, but make a little nuance thing. I think that is more like on the faith side with Christianity. With Plato,
I'm not talking about Christianity at all. I'm talking about Plato. I'm talking about Platonism.
Yeah. So
I'm talking about original Platonism.
Yeah. So with Plato, well, I suppose you do believe it, don't you? If you're turning your soul around and turning towards the forms, and then you know, and trying to journey towards the ineffable, inexpressible, you know, oneness beyond being, then I guess you do believe, don't you? You know.
And you're not just doing it as a practice. that will bring
No,
about
that's right. That's
result.
right. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
are doing it because you believe it.
Yeah. So it's a bit like people who criticize people doing yoga at the gym and they're not really into it. Yeah, that's that sort of thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Thanks, Norman.
I actually, when I read Plato, for me, there is some believing, but ultimately it is about what I experience. It's an experiencing, it's a embodiment of the knowledge rather than a belief. It's more
Yeah, that's how I see it too.
It's at a soul level rather than at a mental level. And just going back to what you said before, I'm not really sure that I've accepted the idea that Plato had a negative attitude to the Greek myths. I think he used ambivalent attitude. I think he had an ambivalent attitude to the Greek myths being used for sociological purposes, but for an individual embodiment, a mysticism. Like, he never criticized the mystic groups, did he?
No.
Did he? No. So
not the mystics.
It was all about the individual response rather than using the myths as a control.
Yeah.
And further to that, I think it was really interesting when you were talking about using religion to control people, because it's true and it does happen and we witness that. But also, you sometimes take religion away from people to control them, because they do have a sense of identity and freedom through their religion. So both can be true.
Yes, and we know where that's going on at the moment and has gone on in the past. Yeah, very interesting. All right, okay, I am going to just keep going. I'm sorry, guys. We can talk at the end, because I really want to talk about now that, really fun and interesting stuff about the use of allegory, right? The use of allegory by Plato, and then the application of allegorical interpretations in Christianity. Fascinating stuff. So we come now to that other use of myth. So it's allegory, it's showing, not saying. It's a teaching technique, a technique of exposition, to point the way often to inexpressible truths. Those who have read the Republic might recall in Book 5, where Socrates is set to formulate the educational program for the philosopher, for his utopia, and he starts talking rather coyly about the greatest lesson of all, and the form of forms and the form of the good. And then he says this higher truth is beyond description. It's beyond all knowing. In fact, as the form of all being, it's beyond being. So he says, I can't really describe this higher truth. We can only show it, its offspring, in images, in allegories. And this is how the allegorical section of the Republic is introduced, with the allegory of the sun and sunlight. Just as the sun is to visible things, so the form of the good is to the insensible forms. And then we get to the two famous allegories, the divided line analogy, and then the most famous of all, Plato's allegory, the allegory of the cave. Now remember, allegories are self-conscious constructions for their interpretation. Explicit and purposefully, a story is told to show implicit truths that are otherwise difficult to convey. And then 4 centuries later, we find this again in the parables of Jesus. So Alexandra, if you're ready, do you want to just read out that section from the Gospel of Matthew?
Yes. This is from chapter 13. The same day, Jesus left the house and went to the lakeside, where he sat down to teach. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it, while the crowd stood on the shore. He used parables to tell them many things. Once there was a man who went out to sow grain. As he scattered the seed in the field, some of it fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some of it fell on rocky ground where there was little soil. The seeds soon sprouted because the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it burned the young plants, and because the roots had not grown deep enough, the plants soon dried up. Some of the seed fell among thorn bushes, which grew up and choked the plants. But some seeds fell in good soil, and the plants bore grain. Some had 100 grains, others 60, and others 30. Listen then, if you have ears. The disciples came to Jesus and asked him, "Why do you use parables when you talk to the people?" Jesus answered, "The knowledge of the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. For the person who has something will be given more, so that he will have more than enough. But the person who has nothing will have taken away from him even the little he has." Jesus said, "The reason I use parables in talking to them is that they look, but do not see, and they listen, but do not hear or understand. So the prophecy of Isaiah applies to them. This people will listen and listen, but not understand. They will look and look, but not see, because their minds are dull, and they have stopped up their ears and have closed their eyes. Otherwise, their eyes would see, their ears would hear, their minds would understand, and they would turn to me, says God, and I would heal them." Jesus continued, "As for you, how fortunate you are. Your eyes see and your ears hear. I assure you that many prophets and many of God's people wanted very much to see what you see, but they could not, and to hear what you hear, but they did not." Jesus continued, "Listen then, and learn what the parable of the sower means. Those who hear the message about the kingdom but do not understand it are like the seeds that fell along the path. The evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in them. The seeds that fell on rocky ground stand for those who receive the message gladly as soon as they hear it, but it does not sink deep into them, and they don't last long. So when trouble or persecution comes because of the message, they give up at once. The seeds that fell among thorn bushes stand for those who hear the message, but the worries about this life and a love for riches choke the message, and they don't bear fruit. And the seeds sown in the good soil stand for those who hear the message and understand it. They bear fruit, some as much as 100, others 60, others 30. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like this. A man sowed good seed in his field. One night, when everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the plants grew and the heads of grain began to form, then the weeds showed up. The man's servants came to him and said, "Sir, it was good seed you sowed in your field. Where did the weeds come from?" "It was some enemy who did this," he answered. "Do you want us to go and pull up the weeds?" they asked him. "No," he answered, "because as you gather the weeds, you might pull up some of the wheat along with them. Let the wheat and the weeds both grow together until harvest. Then I will tell the harvest workers to pull up the weeds first, tie them in bundles and burn them, and then to gather in the wheat and put it in my barn." Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like this. A man takes a mustard seed and sows it in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it grows up, it is the biggest of all plants. It becomes a tree so that the birds come and make their nest in its branches. Jesus told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like this. A woman takes some yeast and mixes it with a bushel of flour until the whole batch of dough rises. Jesus used parables to tell all these things to the crowds. He would not say a thing to them without using a parable. He did this to make come true what the prophet had said. I will use parables when I speak to them. I will tell them things unknown since the creation of the world.
Thanks, Alexandra. Great. I felt like I was in church. I just needed the reverb.
Sorry about that.
Just a bit more reverb there, maybe it would have been fine. Yeah, so the parables of Jesus. What's the purpose of a parable? According to Jesus, the knowledge of the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, but not to them. The reason I use parables in talking to them is that they look and they don't see. They listen and they don't hear. They don't understand. I will use parables to tell them things unknown since the creation of the world. Now here in Matthew, the word mystery is actually the word mysteria that is used as in the mystery cults. So this is a mystery in that sense. The disciples already know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. They have seen the light, but not these others. Jesus is saying, I'm not preaching to the choir. Those that have the mystical enlightenment, the disciples, have seen more than enough. But of the others, they can't see and continue not to see. The parables are to open their eyes. The stories give them patterns of thinking so that they can then see in the same way with their mind's eye the insensible truth. Now remember how we were talking about the evolution of the Gospels, how the philological analysis shows that they started out as the sayings of Jesus and then it was added on the biographical narrative. Well, by the same analysis, we find that the parables are very primitive. And what came next with the parables was interpretation. So the later Gospels and later versions of the Gospels will have these interpretations, as we see in Matthew here, where the interpretation is thrown in. The allegory is given, and then the interpretation. This invention of stories specifically for their allegorical interpretation is distinctively Hellenistic. Before Hellenistic times, it's found in Plato, as we saw, but you can hardly find any examples earlier. This is not to say that the non-literary technique of interpretation was new to Judaism in Hellenistic times. It wasn't. Dreams and hallucinations are the model of allegorical interpretation. And allegorical interpretation seems to have emerged in Hellenistic culture from divination of dreams, visions, from interpretations of the pronouncements of entranced prophets and oracles, and so on. The major prophets contain many analogies and allegories. Already in Ezekiel, there's a famous allegorical vision, but later in the book of Daniel, this tradition matures with some dreams or visions followed by its interpretation. So in Ezekiel, there's this famous Song of the Vineyard in the 5th book of the prophet of Isaiah. Oh, sorry, no. In the prophet of Isaiah, there's this Song of the Vineyard. This is followed by an interpretation that the people of Judea are the vines planted by God, and the crop of sour grapes is God's disappointment in them becoming unjust murderers, despite all his efforts to care for them. And this is close to what we're coming to, where a traditional story or legend is subject to such an interpretation. We might be familiar with this in modern times, with Nietzsche or with Freud or with Jung. For example, the Greek story of Oedipus is subject to Freud's interpretation. It shows the conflictual relationship between father and son. The son has a primal desire to kill his father so that he can have sex with his mother, just as Oedipus was fated to do. In Hellenistic times, there is evidence that the Stoics were doing a similar allegorical interpretation of Homer. But we only hear about this. The original is lost. What has survived is where the same was done on the old Jewish books by Jewish scholars over in, you guessed it, Alexandria. And by way of example, let's begin with a story from the book of Genesis. Once upon a time, so we're told, a long, long time ago, a descendant of Noah named Abram was called into the service of Yahweh and promised that he will become famous and have many descendants. Your descendants will be an entire nation. The only problem was he had no children and he was getting very, very old. And so was his wife, Sarai. But Sarai had an Egyptian slave girl called Hagar. So the very old and barren Sarai said to her husband, "Why don't you sleep with my slave girl? Perhaps she can give you a child for me." Abraham agreed, took Hagar as his concubine. They had sex and she fell pregnant. So the story goes. But then the pregnant young Hagar became proud and despised her mistress. Sarai blamed Abraham, who backed down saying, "Do what you want with her. She's your slave." Sarai treated her so cruelly that Hagar ran out into the desert, where Yahweh appeared, telling the slave that she will have countless descendants. So go back to Abraham and bear his child. Call him Ishmael. When Ishmael is born, Abraham secures an heir, only he's a bastard. Years later, when Abraham is 99 years old, Yahweh comes back to discuss that deal he made with him earlier. "If you obey me completely, you will be the ancestor of many nations." Yahweh seals the deal by naming Abraham and his wife Sarah. And then, miraculously, Sarah gets pregnant and gives birth to Isaac. So there we have it. So the story goes. These ancient parents bring up these two sons, young Isaac and the older Ishmael, helped by his young mother, the slave Hagar. But then there's this incident. Sarah catches Ishmael teasing Isaac. Furious, she sends Hagar and Ishmael way out into the desert, never to return. So the story goes. This is the word of the Lord. But what does it mean? Philo of Alexander knew exactly what it means. It's an allegory of the preliminary and preparatory role of natural science and academic studies, mathematics, on the ascent to the divine. In this story, at the foundation of the Jewish race and religion, Hagar represents physical science, while sophistry is her bastard son, Ishmael.
Marco, I'm sorry, I've got to say, Ishmael is not a bastard. As son of a legitimate concubine, he is not a bastard.
Okay, all right.
Legitimate son.
Okay, all right, well, we can come back to that later. Okay, Abraham has intercourse first with Hagar as a preparation for his calling as Abraham, that is for intercourse with the virtuous Sarah. In returning to Sarah, Abraham leaves the central study of nature for divine wisdom, for the love of God. The story is telling us that science should be only preparatory for the love of divine wisdom. In the pregnant Hagar, we get a stark warning of the dangers of human pride in wisdom, a denial of its divine source, and a continuation of study in the absence of virtuous service only gives birth to sophistry. The child Ishmael serves the contrast between divine Sophia, studying truth and attaining knowledge of the true Logos, with the sophists, soul-destroying persuasion to false opinion. The latter is rightly banished to the wilderness. Philo discovered not only this hidden truth in this story, but so many other hidden truths in all the Jewish stories, where he found the most ancient wisdom. What we know of Philo is that he was a Hellenistic Jew who could not read Hebrew, who was steeped in Greek philosophy, wrote in Greek around the time of Jesus, only over in Alexandria. His voluminous writings have survived because of their esteem in the subsequent Christian tradition. In his extensive writings, Philo uses allegorical interpretation on ancient Jewish stories appearing to the modern eye at best strained, if not entirely incredible. But Philo himself seems very persuaded by his interpretations, and soon so also will be his Christian fans. And this is how Judaism was found to be forever and always teaching Platonic conceptions, and especially a monotheistic theology. The most startling performance of this technique is where he explains away all the anthropomorphic attributes of Yahweh as symbolic stories designed to teach a vulgar audience the principles of a theology. And with all plurality of the divine similarly explained away, we arrive with a theology of the most exalted, unchanging, and undifferentiated divine creator. So for Greek wisdom itself, if it appears to be, say, the same thing, saying the same thing, Greek wisdom is saying the same thing, then it only is repeating this wisdom. It's derivative. True and pure wisdom comes directly from God, directly from the Jewish God. The story of Ishmael shows how God long ago explained this very relationship in knowledge. In painting Judaism Platonic, he then subverts Platonism in the same way that Platonism or Plato subverts other philosophies by saying that they are not the true and divine wisdom. So he uses the same technique to subvert Plato. This should be compared with a more typical attitude in the idea of a perennial philosophy in early Greek and Hellenistic philosophy. Remember, I said that the Greeks borrowed from the Egyptians and Babylonian tradition, and this was celebrated. And in fact, an ancient pedigree lent credibility to something. So something that even was novel, they tended to say that it came from an ancient pedigree. Well, this same ancient pedigree is celebrated in Philo and in these other Jewish writers, but it's exclusively Jewish. Here in Hellenistic Judaism, its own Hellenistic transformation was, consciously or unconsciously, I don't know, denied in a Jewish exclusivism. And this would set the pattern for Christianity, the Christian treatment of Hellenistic schools. It would take on their teachings as their own, through allegorical interpretation of their legends, and then come to reject the original sources. This Christian exclusivism strengthened down through the centuries. By the 4th and 5th centuries, all else was false, heretical, intolerable. The philosophical schools were soon subject to persecution until finally by the 6th century, they were forced to close and their teachers persecuted. We can now see why Philo, the Jew, has always been considered so important to the history of Christianity. With the early Christian fathers, what Philo called philosophy became theology, which is only to follow the Hellenistic way of identifying the love of wisdom of Sophia with the study of God, theos. Augustine was only translating into Latin what is explicit in the Greek when he said that the true philosopher is one who loves God. Allegorical interpretation would soon fall from favour, but by then it had already done its job, not only in Hellenizing Christianity, but also in maintaining the link with old Judaism. The link was retained, but still the difference between the old and the new teaching was retained. And this would be interpreted as the Old and New Testament, the Old and New Covenant, the old and the new way of Christ. As we've already seen, this distinction between old and new is most striking in Paul, where he looks back on unconverted Jews with disdain. Christianity is Judaism's divinely ordained successor. Get with the program. And we even find this in Paul with a new allegorical interpretation of this Hagar-Ishmael story. In Paul's letters to the Galatians, Paul says that Hagar represents the old Jewish covenant and the old Jerusalem, and that Jews are born into divine enslavement under the law, enslavement under God. Remember how Ishmael had teased Isaac? For Paul, this is the Jewish rejection of Jesus. Those who turned against their own Messiah, the one who was born of God's Spirit. What did the Jews do? They put him on trial under the law. In the first covenant, the Jews lived in slavery under the law, and those who had not come over to Christ remained in slavery. But the followers of Christ live in the freedom from the law. The physical city of Jerusalem remained enslaved, but the heavenly, non-physical Jerusalem is free. Paul's letter to the Galatians remains a tour de force, one of the earliest Christian documents to survive. This letter includes an allegorical interpretation of crucifixion. Paul says, I am dead to the law, killed by the law itself. I have been put to death with Christ on his cross, so that it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. By means of his cross, the world is dead to me, and I am dead to the world. The use of allegory will continue within and close to the New Testament interpretations. The story of the resurrection of Jesus is an allegory for the redemption of souls. The rite of the very Mass, the Last Supper, is an allegorical foundation for the ritual magic of the Mass. This is my body, this is my blood. Eat me, for I am the sacrificial Lamb of God who takes away all sins. Allegorical interpretation was essential to the success of any Christian wishing to find the derivation of doctrine from the canon. But what we can say is that Philo's commentary upon the law shows the remarkable way by which a tradition can transcend itself in an apparent continuity. And it also shows how we could come to such an extraordinary canonical structure of Christianity with these two very different testaments. Without Philo's strategies, Christianity would hardly have had this option. With this strategy, all the stories, old and new, could be gathered under the blanket of Platonic monotheism. Now, I just want to finish by pausing and looking at the peculiarity of Christianity and Judaism and comparing this with Platonism. So consider, the Greeks had an Old Testament to deal with as well. While the Hellenistic pantheon bears little resemblance to the deity of Israel, their legends, especially those of Hesiod and Homer, had something of the status of the Mosaic books at the time of the early philosophers, Pythagoreans and Plato. They were revered by state and society, and they were taught in the schools where the boys would learn their enthusiastic performance. And there was a tendency to read them as authorities on all sorts of subjects. Now, Plato thought this was ridiculous and says so. And Plato was most concerned about the negative moral influence of these stories upon the youth and upon society in general. Many passages are gruesome. Others celebrate as heroes cruel and wicked acts, while others misrepresent God, who is essentially good. They are not good models for soul and society, and Plato went as far as to ban poetry, as we said, from the Republic. So now consider the transition to Christian doctrine from Jewish myth. Direct references to the Old Testament in the New Testament are many, and they also bind in this whole prophecy of the of Jesus as the Messiah. But then there's all this raillery against the Jewish religion, against authority, against the dead letter of the law, and the implication of the Jews in the killing of the God King. There is no such raillery again in Plato, and his deference to Homer and to the other legends of gods and men is of a highest order and detachment. Yet religious Platonism breaks free of the Greek legends, gently and respectfully, while Christianity remains forever wedded to theirs, wrestling with them and periodically receding back into it. Philo's allegorical interpretation of Jewish scriptures not only made Platonism possible for Christianity, but Judaism as well. Okay, how are we going? Any questions or comments or reflections on that?
Did Philo first write the metaphor of Hagar and Sarah?
No,
Did he find a metaphor in the story? Was it Philo who found a metaphor in the story of Hagar and Sarah?
So Hagar and Sarah's story is in Genesis, and then Philo made an allegorical interpretation of it. I don't know of any earlier one. There might be an earlier one, or talk of it. And then Paul did his own version, which was the Christian version. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. And I suppose I would make the comment that if you can find a metaphor in anything if you look for it.
Well, it was a clever strategy then, wasn't it? It worked well.
Yeah.
It was a very powerful strategy in that way of thinking. Yeah. Thanks, Kula.
I might say, when you're talking about the history of Christianity, you're often talking about, Bernie, the history of an idea of mainstream Orthodox Christianity, which is very hard to define in that even if you do go in a mainstream Orthodox way, you're still going to get divisions between like the Arian and the Athanasian, and then between the within the Athanasian, you're going to get between the Monophysite and the Nestorian and the Chalcedonian, and then within the like Chalcedonian, you're going to go to like Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. And off from the Catholics, you're going to get the Protestants. If you like look at it as in that sort of way, some of those points look like suppression, and some of them look like creation. I'm not a great fan of the Council of Nicaea, but the Council of Chalcedon looks like a great deal of fun. Like it's it's the intellectual version of the dome of the Hagia Sophia. I mean, like how are you going to keep that up? Okay. Oh, whoops! It did fall down once, but it's up there again.
Okay, thanks, Norman. Thanks for that. I noticed that I've gone a bit late, so maybe we'll get another question or another comment, reflection.
I have found today's session absolutely gobsmackingly. I mean, it's not really even a question. It's just so much that I just need to say a huge thank you, to Alexandra, to everybody who has read, and I just want to go, wow. I mean, for me, it's kind of been really, even when Phil was reading, I was actually thinking how interesting it was, because I'm going, this sounds so familiar. What is so familiar about it? And then, when I realized that he was talking about, and when you're good, then you go here, and then if you're, then you can come back, and then you can try it again. And I'm going this, and then I went, oh, this sounds like the wheel of reincarnation, right? And then you started talking about reincarnation. So whilst I maybe I made that connection, and maybe it wasn't actually there, but I'm just finding this entire course really, it's like I'm finding all these odd pieces of a puzzle that I didn't, that I had just thrown away in a box somewhere. So I guess I just want to say thank you. I'm actually quite gobsmacked. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, I just say that, it is our tradition. It's our tradition. It's our culture. It's European culture. If
yes,
most of us got a connection with that. It's European culture, and we've come out of a dogmatic period, a long dogmatic period, and now in a way we can kind of reclaim it and put the pieces back together in the way that we want to, in the way that it works for us. And so yeah, if that's what you're getting out of this, that's great, because that's certainly the intention.
Great.
Anyone else especially hasn't spoken? Oh, David, I'll leave it with you. Have we got some questions on?
Nothing in the chat, just praises for the reading, which is very nice. It was great.
Yeah, and I should say again, thank you, Phil and Alexandra, for volunteering to do that. That was great. Gave me a bit of a rest, and I could listen, and so that was really nice. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you, Phil and Alexandra, and who else? That was it.
Well,
maybe
questions
Bernie, of course. Thank you, Bernie.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there's David, if I can jump in. Well, if there's one final question, or otherwise we'll say goodbye, and then we can do our little chat afterwards if people want to hang around, like you're leaving the room, sort of thing. Is there one final question?
Is there is one more week, is there not? For this?
Yeah, so there's one more week, and next week we're going to do mysticism, which is really exciting history, which a lot of people don't know about. Again, So, and you know, the mystical tradition and how it comes out of Platonism is fascinating. And so I hope people enjoy that, whether or not you're into mystical Christianity or mystical Platonism or not. It's a great story. So I hope people enjoy that. And I'll also add that bit that if you look up on the website, I also mention Christianity's oldest creation. We've already addressed this a bit. It's how the Christian thinkers and the tradition comes to terms with the fact in different ways that it's borrowing ideas from somewhere else. So that's also a fascinating story, how people justify it or actually psychologically believe, you know, really believe it, really believe that this is the way things are, that Christianity is as old as creation or some other thing like that. So thanks everyone for coming along. Hope to see some of you guys next Sunday at Maria's place. And yeah, stick around because we'll have a little cup of tea afterwards. And if you want to ask a further question or just say hi, then we'll see you then. But otherwise, see you next week. Okay.